Welcome back to Analysis, where we've been looking at the latest developments in Syria. In this part of the programme, we'll be examining the up-and-coming elections, where President Bashar al-Assad is running for another 7-year term in office. But can elections be held in a country that's at war, and what will another Assad victory mean? And how will the international community respond? Well, my guests from the studio are still with me, and in this half we're joined on Skype by Mimi Al-Aham, who's a Syrian political commentator. Welcome back to the programme. So, I mean, this set of elections, they can't be really taken to mean very much in democratic terms, can they?
Absolutely. I mean, how on earth you can hold a presidential election in a war zone? This is the question. And the other thing, I mean, is it appropriate is it appropriate to ask Syrians to go and choose their next leader while they are living while they are surrounded by death, hunger, and fear of retaliation? This is the question. And the other thing, I mean, is it really, do we have the infrastructure to run a presidential election at the moment? And after 3 years of a war, of Assad's oppression against the Syrian people, are the Syrians mentally and emotionally ready to go and vote? Absolutely not.
Dr. Fikri, what do you think about the legitimacy of these elections?
I don't think that it has any credibility at all. After 3 years of war and the damage and 300,000 killed, 7-8 million now are immigrated, I don't think that this is at all a way to say that we can do an election. Also, the person himself, Bashar al-Assad, has no way to sit or to settle, or the country can be settled with this man and his regime. For sure, the Syrian people will never accept to stay or to continue or to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. Now the bloodshed which had happened within the last 3 years, and as well as the massacre, the death, and so will never give a chance or an opportunity that this man would continue to be in power. If he will stay in power, this means that the massacre is continued and the revolution will continue for sure.
Mimi Al-Aham, let me just bring you into the discussion here. I mean, even if there were no civil war still going on, with millions of people displaced, there can't be a sensible election procedure, can there?
Well, I think it's very interesting that you say that in a war it's not possible to hold a legitimate election, but neither the United Nations or the West media questioned whether Iraq's election was legitimate or Afghanistan's current election was legitimate, and they are both conducted under full-blown occupation. So clearly there's a political bias in just singling out the Syrian election, which is currently under a state of civil war. I mean, it's only Ban Ki-moon saying that the Syrian elections are a threat to peace here. So he's not saying that so much about Afghanistan or Iraq or any of the other elections are held under similar circumstances. One of you, no way will the Syrian people choose Assad.
I think certainly many people in this country who didn't support the Afghan occupation or the Iraq occupation would have said the same things about them. They would have said, yeah, you're right. It's a fake election, puppet leader emerged out of it, it was wrong.
And I would agree with them completely. But the fact is Syria is not under occupation. Syria is trying to repel a foreign invasion of these Salafi groups that believe that Syria is somehow their land because their brand or their interpretation of Islam determines this so. And not only that, but of course the NATO states are also trying to influence Syria. So in Syria's case, it's not under a foreign occupation, it's under the Syrian state that the elections are being held. And certainly wouldn't be the first time that an election is held under a state of war.
Although the conditions are of displacement, that the number of deaths, the number of people who have left the country are even greater than they were in Iraq.
Well, actually, in Iraq, there was 2 million refugees by the end of it, and of course, 1 million deaths. So
and some are saying
we don't want to get into the statistics of it, but the numbers
are important. I mean, if there were only 2 refugees, we'd say, yeah, you can go ahead with an election with only 2 refugees. But seeing there are millions, it's a rather different. The numbers do matter.
Unfortunately, Syria's constitution says that the presidential election, presidential term can only last for 7 years. So to say that the circumstances for an election are bad, yes, of course they are bad. I'll agree with you completely. But according to the constitution, they must be held. And if they are not held, then the own state would be in breach of its own constitution. And again, people would say that there's been no reforms at all, and that the state continues on with this dictatorship. So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation.
Okay, Abdulaziz, I mean, what do you make of some of the election law? I mean, there's Section 30 of the election law, which says that a candidate must be at least 40 years old, a permanent resident of Syria, or at least for the past 10 years, married to a Syrian citizen, and with no criminal record. I mean,
Well,
that limits the number of candidates, rather, doesn't it?
Okay, there's like a massive question mark about the constitution itself. If we go back in 2000, when Bashar al-Assad succeeded his father, it was the same. The president has to be 40 years old, but the constitution was reformed in one night just to fit Bashar al-Assad himself. So basically, the constitution in Syria is written by Assad family, and they can change it just to fit themselves.
Yes, I agree completely with Brother Aziz. I would like to say that it is a very silly movie, this presidential election. It is the same as the Sisi in Egypt. It is only one man, one show, one figure. And the problem here is not regarding is there an election or not. It is the matter that the people, they don't want him. The people have sacrificed. There is a river of bloodshedding. It is not imaginable that this matter would continue and peace will be settled in this country. Bashar should leave either peacefully or by this revolution. Syria should build itself again without Bashar and his regime. I don't think that there is an argument about this regarding the normal Syrian people. I would like to add something that your guest said about the Salafis and the foreigners. The real foreigners are the Iranian troops. The troops which are coming from Iran, there are troops and militants from Iraq, there are militants from Lebanese, and this is completely well known by the whole world. If there are individuals, yes, some individuals can come, but these are not as the great support of Iran and Russia. Russia is the main support of the Syrian regime, and I would like to say that if there is no Iranian support, this Bashar al-Assad would fall down within few days or weeks.
Well, let's come back to that, but just maybe on the question of the electoral law. I mean, it's got a series of hurdles in it which are absolutely unprecedented in any normal democratic society, hasn't it?
Well, you know, it's very interesting to compare different democracies in the world. I think there's no democracy on earth that you will find that is absolutely perfect. Even if you look at the United States, they've had a Bush and a Clinton, and then a Bush and a Clinton in power several times, and it just seems that these two families have been in power for 30 years.
Well,
at least
they swapped it between two families. There's only one in Syria.
Yeah, actually. Well, you know what? Now there's three candidates, so there's a reform in Syria. And the thing is, Syria's problems are Syria's problems. They're not the world's problems. And the fact that the world has interfered in Syria has resulted in so much bloodshed. And, you know, I'm not going to say that Syria's election is perfect. By far, it's not. And there needs to be some serious improvements and reforms in Syria, but that should not be done at the barrel of a gun. I think that the fact that the media is coming down so hard on Syria's elections is, let's face it, definitely because they feel threatened by the elections. They feel that it is a threat to the perception of a possible victory for the rebellion they're supporting. One of your guests said the Syrian people will not choose Assad. No, I think it's very interesting for someone to claim to support democracy, but then to go and choose for the Syrian people what they would select. Again, it's a threat to the West's objectives for the elections to take place. And the fact that it's such a threat can be seen reflected in the Syrian insurgents of the FSA themselves, who kidnapped one of the presidential candidates, Mohammed Kanan, and asked him to say on camera at gunpoint that the elections were a fraud. This is the kind of democracy that they want, they have in mind for Syria, a democracy at gunpoint. But we're criticizing what we have instead of what is being offered to us, which is
let me put some of this point to Abdulaziz. I mean, actually, if the elections go ahead like this, I mean, it will be a propaganda victory for the rebels, not for the regime, won't it? Because, I mean, the regime is running a fake election. The rebels have always said it was a dictatorship. It's going to look like one. So, I mean, actually, as far as most people are concerned, this is going to aid the rebels, not make it life more difficult for them.
Well, the thing is, I mean, everybody knows around the world this is such a joke. This is not an election, and it is kind of madness to hold an election in Syria nowadays. But I think Assad, by standing to the presidential election, he wants to secure his position in the presidential palace for 7 more years, just to give him some legitimacy. Okay, I was elected by the Syrian people, and we all know the election will be held in just certain areas in Syria. The other thing, he wants to secure himself a position as a terror, as a counter-terror partner with the West. But while the fact is he released a lot of extremists from his jails at the beginning of the revolution, and we have them now in Syria, which is called ISIS. The majority of them were in Assad's jails. He released them, and they are cooperating with him, and they are in a state of war with the FSA. So basically, any result, any outcome of this election should be dealt with as shouldn't be legitimate. The UN, the international community, must deliver a strong message. This election is fake and invalid.
Do you think that we've talked about the refugees that are outside the country, but there's 6 million people displaced within the country. I mean, there's no way of having a serious ballot, is there?
I think this is a very important issue and point. How are you going to make the voting, and who are going to vote? Now, more than the UN now statistics, they said that more than 7 million have been already displaced outside Syria, in the borders with Turkey, with Lebanon, and then Jordan, and everywhere nowadays, 7 million at least. And they said this is the highest immigration displacing people in the last century. Number two, the people even in Syria. How can you, let us ask them, are you going to vote for the man who killed your parents, your brothers, the man who imprisoned hundreds and thousands, the man who is a real dictator, who put Syria on the ground for years and years? There was no presidential election for 40 years at all. And now this, the story of democracy, which is highly propagated all over the world, he wants to get the favorite of it, and he wants to be part of the great show. And again, let me say it again, it is a conspiracy, international conspiracy.
Let me just, just the internal displacement, never mind about the refugees abroad, but just the internal displacement of some 6 million people. I mean, you just simply can't run a legitimate poll with that kind of level of displacement, can you?
Well, the United Nations will be observing the elections, so whether the elections themselves are legitimate is up to the United Nations and the Syrian people, really. It's not, what others who are not Syrian think about it is completely irrelevant. But there are, lots of issues. There are polling stations inside the country that will help those which are internally displaced. Those that are externally displaced would have to visit embassies. As a part of the Syrian diaspora, I will not be able to vote because the embassy in my country has closed down. So there are all of these problems with the election, but the alternative that is being offered to us is a selection by the United States and Saudi Arabia, puppets that are being imposed on us, such as Ahmed Jarba. And this is clearly, the Syrian election is clearly the better of the two offers that are being, given to the Syrian people.
I mean, Abdulaziz, the opposition would be stronger if that charge couldn't be made against it. If the charge of, relating to the Americans, relating to the Saudis, if the opposition could say, that's why we boycotted the Istanbul talks. We never went to the Istanbul talks because this kind of thing would be said. That would have been a better course, wouldn't it?
Well, to be honest, as we said earlier, we have a conspiracy in Syria against the Syrian people, against the Syrian revolution. This is the fact. And Ahmed Jarba, he is not a president of Syria. He was appointed as a president of the coalition and the outsider, and he doesn't really run even the opposition within Syria. But the thing is, I mean, actually, I can't even. how on earth people on the outside will go and vote if, according to the instruction of the election, if you left the country illegally, you don't have a right to vote. If you have a passport which is invalid, you don't have a right to vote. And we all know more than 2.5 million refugees fled the country illegally because they wanted to save their lives. I mean, basically, they don't have a right to vote. People within Syria have been criminalized. And obviously, if anyone is criminalized, he doesn't have a right to vote. So basically, if we look at it, maybe only the inner circle of Assad are allowed to vote for him, and this is it.
Dr. Fikri, what effect do you think pushing ahead with the elections will have on the peace talks? I mean, the peace talks, let's face it, aren't very healthy at the moment, but Assad pushing ahead with this is much more likely for the opposition to walk out of them. I mean, they're not walking out because the Americans have got their hand behind their back, haven't they?
Yes. I think he wants to save more and more time. He is trying to appear in front of the world that he has credibility. He is illegally will be voted as a president. But in my opinion, that all of this will come to a blocked end, the same as Geneva 1, Geneva 2, the peace talks in Istanbul. I would like to say that on the ground, it is a real revolution. The people are, all of them, the majority of the Syrian people, they want this regime to come to an end, and there is no other options. Either it will come to an end or the revolution will continue. The issue of the election and the voting and presidential, I think, again, it is a very silly movement that has no credibility on earth at all.
Actually, I need to add something. I mean, Assad all the time, the media of Assad, just accusing the extremists, foreign fighters who caused the destruction in Syria. Okay, if I agree with them as a Syrian, if I said, okay, the whole destruction in the country have been caused by the opposition or by extremists or by terrorists, whatever, then Assad failed to protect the country. Why Assad didn't protect us? Why Assad didn't protect the civilians of Syria? If he failed, then he must resign. I mean, look at the West. If for a very silly reason, you can see the whole of the government just over their resignation, while in Syria more than 200,000 people have been killed by the extremists. 7 million have been displaced within Syria by the extremists. 2.5 million have been fled the country by the extremists, and Assad want to stand for the election. He is failed, even if the whole ordeal of the Syria have been caused by the opposition, then he failed to protect the country and the nation. Then he must resign, not go for the election.
Maybe wouldn't it have been more sensible to actually say, look, this election can't be held, whatever the Constitution says, it can't be held under these conditions. The only way in which an election could actually be held is if there was some kind of joint process emerging out of the peace talks.
Well, who are we talking to in Geneva? As your own guest said, Jarba doesn't have any influence inside Syria. The leader of the opposition in Geneva doesn't have any following or influence inside Syria. So what is the point of going there and continuing with the farce that is Geneva that really only benefits the proxy states that are trying to influence the war in Syria, which is Russia and the US? And one of your guests also said, again, that the foreign influence inside Syria include Russia and Iran. But of course, Russia and Iran are Syria's allies, and as such, Syria has the right to accept help from Iran and Russia, whereas the US is acting against international law to fund an insurrection in a foreign country that is sovereign. So one other thing I wanted to mention was I believe someone said that the rebels would have a media victory with these elections. I'm not sure that holding one of the presidential delegates at gunpoint and having him say what you want is some kind of media victory. I think the fear here is that the whole point of these elections is that there's a media victory in the sense that if these elections take place, it makes it more obvious that the Syrian military is making gains on the ground and that the government is more sure of itself. And so if you ask me, is it logical whether or not to hold an election, in terms of media, it's logical to hold them.
Okay. Abdulaziz, do you think that the fact that this crisis is now running in parallel with the crisis in Ukraine may make for more positive conditions for the rebels in Syria, because the Russian backing may be weakened by domestic interests at home? Or do you think it will make it more likely that the Russians want to punish the Americans over the Ukraine by continuing to support the Assad regime?
Well, as I said, I mean, Russia is imperialist power. So basically, I hope that I don't think, I can't see the Russian will stop providing Assad with help, militarily, financially, and even politically. Because just recently, a company, the armed company from Russia, announced they will deliver 32 air jets to Assad. So basically, they have escalated their support to Assad, and that happened after the crisis of Ukraine.
So, Dr. Fikri, is that how you see it, that the Russians are more likely to punish the Americans for the Ukraine by increasing support to Assad?
Yes, to a certain extent. I think the political game here is very clear. Even with the case of Ukraine, now Russia is raising the flag of the gas. We supply many of the European countries with the Russian gas, and we can do some issues as also a punishment or a threat even to the European countries. So they are playing games with their political cards. But regarding Syria, it is now a real war, a civil war. There is a bloodshed. The political cards here are few. What is on the ground, it will win the victory. And I'm still having the full confidence that the revolution will win the victory, because they still, alhamdulillah, having control of many areas. And they are, even the withdrawal of Homs, it was a very honorable withdrawal. The people, or the fighters were going with full dignity, with all weapons, after more than 1 year of complete sanction.
Okay. Mimi, how do you read the situation in relationship to the Ukraine? Do you think that the regime depends on its Russian weaponry? Do you think it can still depend on it?
I think most certainly it can. I think that Syria is almost as important to Russia as Ukraine is, especially because it's one of its last ports to the Mediterranean Sea. I think that Ukraine is an interesting case study, because what one of your guests said, it would have been better for Assad to resign, given that he failed to prevent all this bloodshed. Well, the Ukrainian president actually showed weakness or stepped down, left his post, and as a result, Ukraine got balkanized, which is exactly what may have happened to Syria. So, this is something that you have to consider when you ask presidents to step down in such a polarized country. An election is probably better than being separated and divided. And one other thing I'm going to
have to stop you just there, because we've reached the end of analysis for this episode. So I'd like to thank my guests and you at home for watching. Remember, you can continue the debate by looking at our Twitter feed or by following our Facebook page. Thank you very much and good night.